What if the only thing more dangerous than the war you left behind was the history you came home to? For Leo Vance, a man who had spent 2 decades in the Air Force teaching dogs to walk into the heart of danger silence wasn't just golden. It was a sanctuary. It was the reason he'd cashed out his savings for this lonely cabin, a wooden sentinel perched on a cliff overlooking the raw, untamed coast of Oregon. After 20 years of screaming jet engines, of shouted commands, of the deafening percussion of a world at war, the quiet here was a fragile truce he'd brokered with his own ghosts. But on nights like this, the truce was always broken. Sound of a loud thunderclap. The roar of thunder wasn't just a sound. It was a memory. It cracked open the sky, and his skull, dragging him from his fireside chair and throwing him back onto the searing tarmac of a Kandahar airfield. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and rain, suddenly tasted of dust and fear. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner seeking escape. He was there again, the weight of his body armor pressing him down the chaos. And then a different pressure. A wet nose pushed firmly into his trembling hand. A heavy, solid weight leaned against his legs. It was Shadow. His 7-year-old black Labrador. His partner. His anchor in the storm of his own mind. Shadow didn't whine or bark. He simply applied his presence, a steady, living counterpressure to the phantom forces pulling Leo apart. His dark, intelligent eyes watched Leo's, and in them was a language they had both learned in the theater of war, a language of unwavering loyalty. "I'm here. Come back." Leo's breath hitched, then steadied. He ran a hand over the dog's velvet head, the simple tactile sensation, a lifeline back to the here and now. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was a fellow veteran, and he knew the sound of incoming fire, whether it came from the sky or from within. This cabin wasn't just a home. It was a fortress against Leo's past, and Shadow was its most vigilant guard. He still performed his old duties with a quiet dignity. He would clear a room before Leo entered his nose, twitching his body language, a subtle map of his surroundings. He would sit and watch the dark tree line for hours, a silent guardian against threats only he could perceive. To an outsider, it might have looked like a dog's quirky habit. To Leo, it was a ritual that kept the world from closing in. They were two old soldiers holding the line together. But the storm this night was different. It was a primal beast hurling itself against the coast with a fury Leo had never seen. The wind shrieked like a tortured soul, and the rain came down in sheets, blurring the world into a gray, churning chaos. Then came the sound. It wasn't thunder. It was a deep, guttural groan from the earth itself, a sickening crunch of rock and roots giving way. Leo and Shadow both rushed to the window. A massive section of the cliff face beneath the cabin had sheared away, collapsing into the churning ocean below. The landslide had taken with it a swath of ancient pine trees and a century of earth, leaving a raw, bleeding wound in the side of the cliff. But in the heart of that wound, something impossible was revealed. A door. Not wood, but thick, rusted iron riveted and grim-set directly into the black volcanic rock. It was a scar from another time, a secret the land itself had been forced to give up. It was a door that had no business being there, a door that led into the dark, hidden belly of the world. For a man who had come here seeking only peace, the sight of it was a declaration of war. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that whatever lay behind that door was not meant to be found. He had spent his life walking into dangerous places, but this felt different. This was a danger that had been waiting for him buried in his own bloodline. Because you see, peace is not the absence of noise, but the mastery of it. And Leo was about to learn that for some, the silence is where the real ghosts live. He looked down at Shadow, whose low, rumbling growl confirmed what he already knew. Their war wasn't over a new one was just beginning. And to understand the enemy they were about to face, they first had to unlock a history written in salt lies and stone. A history that began with a lockbox and a librarian who held the key. Some doors are meant to be opened. Others are warnings. Standing before the iron slab, slick with sea salt and time, Leo Vance felt the familiar cold hum of a mission about to begin. The rusted hinges screamed in protest as he and Shadow forced the door inward, opening a throat of darkness that smelled of brine-damp earth and something else. Secrets. With a tactical flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the gloom, they stepped across the threshold, leaving the storm-ravaged present for a perfectly preserved past. The sea cave wasn't natural. Its walls were roughly hewn, reinforced with thick, moss-covered timbers, the kind used by smugglers and bootleggers a century ago. Rotting crates and shattered bottles littered the floor, ghosts of a bygone era of illicit trade. But Leo's training taught him to see what was out of place. Tucked away in a small, man-made alcove shielded from the tide was a small, lead-lined lockbox. It was heavy-sealed by time and corrosion. Back in the cabin with the storm still rattling the windows, Leo carefully pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal and a set of rolled, brittle maps. The ink in the journal was faded, the handwriting a desperate scrawl, but the words were a lightning strike. It was the journal of his great-grandfather, a man he'd only known from a single stoic photograph. The entries started with hope. They spoke of a secret partnership with a brilliant Norwegian immigrant, a fisherman named Anders Larsen. Together, they hadn't been smuggling whiskey. They had discovered something far more valuable. The maps weren't of shipping lanes. They were detailed geological surveys of this very coastline, pointing to a rich, untapped deposit of a rare mineral. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Hope curdled into paranoia. His great-grandfather wrote of a third partner, a wealthy investor from the city, and a growing fear of betrayal. The final entry was chillingly abrupt. Anders is right. He's coming for it all. God help us. The journal was a dead end, a story with no final chapter. To find answers, Leo knew he needed more than a flashlight. He needed context. He drove into the nearby coastal town of Port Blossom, a place that seemed to pride itself on holding on to its history, and walked into the town's historical archive, a quiet, sun-drenched library that smelled of old paper and beeswax. And that's where he met Clara. She was the town librarian, a woman with eyes as sharp and inquisitive as the historical records she curated. When Leo showed her a photograph of the journal, her professional calm shattered. She led him into a back room, and from a locked file she pulled out a faded photograph of two men standing on a fishing boat. One was Leo's great-grandfather. The other, she said, her voice trembling, with a lifetime of inherited questions, was her great-grandfather, Anders Larsen. Her family's story was the missing piece of the puzzle. They were told Anders had stolen from his partners and fled back to Norway, a coward and a thief who had abandoned his family. It was a story Clara had never believed. As this revelation hung in the air, Leo's phone buzzed. It was an email from a company called Titan Dynamics. They knew he had inherited the Cliffside property. They were making him an offer to buy it. It wasn't just a generous offer. It was an astronomical one, the kind of money that could make a man forget any question he ever had. It felt less like a real estate proposal and more like a bribe. A warning. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture far more sinister than Leo could have imagined. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a conspiracy still alive and breathing after 70 years. Back at the library, poring over the journal, Clara noticed something Leo had dismissed. The very last page after the final, terrified entry contained a strange, childlike drawing, a cluster of 7 dots connected by lines looking like a constellation. Leo had assumed it was a meaningless doodle. But Clara, who had grown up on these shores, knew it instantly. "That's not a constellation in the sky," she whispered, her eyes wide with realization. "Those are the 7 sisters. It was the local name for a unique formation of sea stacks, jagged spires of rock that jutted out of the ocean, visible only from the mouth of the smuggler's cave at the lowest tide. It wasn't a doodle, it was a map. The secret wasn't buried in the cave. The cave was the key to finding it. A new kind of battlefield was now defined. On one side, Leo and Clara armed with a 70-year-old journal and a map disguised as stars. On the other, the unseen powerful entity of Titan Dynamics, a corporate Goliath with limitless resources and a clear vested interest in ensuring the past remained buried. The race was on, but it wasn't just for a hidden treasure. It was a race for the truth, and to reclaim the honor of two families who had been wronged by the same shadow. And Leo knew with a soldier's grim certainty that this new enemy wouldn't be content to just send emails for long. The moment Leo and Clara joined forces, the nature of the fight changed. It was no longer a quiet investigation into the past. It became a war. And the first shots were fired not with bullets, but with the cold, silent weapons of corporate power. The astronomical offer from Titan Dynamics was rescinded as quickly as it had appeared. In its place came the pressure. It started subtly. A letter from the county arrived suddenly, challenging the property lines that had stood for a century. Then unmarked vans began parking at the end of Leo's long gravel driveway. Men in crisp suits taking photographs from a distance. One morning, Leo woke to the high-pitched whine of a commercial drone hovering over his cabin. Its camera a single unblinking eye. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a siege. Titan Dynamics was a modern-day dragon, and it intended to scorch the earth to get to the treasure it believed lay buried beneath. Leo the soldier reacted as he was trained. He began to fortify his position. He installed security cameras, reinforced the locks, and walked the perimeter of his property with Shadow at his side, every sense on high alert. He was digging in, preparing for a direct assault. "This is a mistake, Leo," Clara told him during one of their tense strategy sessions in the library's back room. "You're treating this like a military operation. You're trying to hold a trench. But you can't fight an enemy like Titan Dynamics in the shadows. That's where they live. That's where they win. Our only weapon is the truth, and the truth needs sunlight." The strategic conflict between them was a chasm. He saw the world as a battlefield. She saw it as a courtroom and a newsroom. He wanted to protect the evidence until they had a perfect case. She argued that leaking parts of the story, getting ahead of the corporate narrative, was their only chance. This friction, this push and pull between two desperate allies, became as dangerous as the enemy outside. The real lesson came one moonless night. Leo was jolted from a restless sleep not by a sound, but by the lack of it. The normal night chorus of crickets and frogs was dead silent, and beside his bed, Shadow was rigid, standing with his head low, a growl vibrating so deep in his chest it was more a feeling than a sound. It was the same silent alert he'd used to signal a hidden IED in Afghanistan. Leo grabbed a heavy flashlight and moved to the window. Two figures dressed in black were moving stealthily from the tree line toward the cliff's edge, toward the hidden cave. They weren't surveyors. They were professionals. He slammed the floodlights on, bathing the area in stark, brilliant white. The figures froze for a second, then sprinted back into the darkness. But the message was clear. They were done with intimidation. They were coming for the secret itself. Shadow had not just been a comfort. He had been their early warning system. He had saved them. That night, Leo realized the terrifying flaw in his own logic. A common mistake for a soldier: you focus so hard on the enemy in front of you that you don't realize the battlefield itself is a trap. Titan Dynamics didn't need to break down his door. They were just waiting, applying pressure, knowing that eventually he'd be forced to make a move. They were hurting him. He looked at the sea stack map, then at the tide charts Clara had printed. The lowest tide of the month, the king tide, was just 2 days away. It was their only window to follow the map and uncover the final piece of the puzzle. But now they knew with chilling certainty that they wouldn't be going alone. The dragon was awake, It was watching, and it was hungry. The most dangerous enemies Leo now understood don't break down your door. They just quietly buy the land your door is on and wait for you to come out. And as the clock ticked down to the king tide, Leo and Clara prepared to walk out that door and into a confrontation that would either unearth the truth or bury them with it forever. 2 days later, under a sky the color of slate, the ocean pulled back from the shore in a great silent exhale. The king tide had arrived. It exposed a world normally hidden beneath the waves, a jagged landscape of dark, slick rock and tidal pools teeming with life. And there, standing like ancient moss-covered sentinels against the horizon, were the 7 sisters. The sea stacks from the journal's map. There was no time for hesitation. With Shadow scouting ahead, his paws nimble on the treacherous terrain, Leo and Clara raced against the clock of the returning sea. Following the cryptic lines drawn on the map, they navigated the base of the stacks. The map wasn't a map to a location, but a series of instructions. Where the third sister casts its morning shadow, walk the length of a fisherman's mast, find the rock that weeps. They found it a fissure in the cliff face almost invisible from which a steady trickle of fresh water wept down the rock. Just as Anders Larsen must have done nearly a century ago, Leo pushed against it. With a low groan of grinding stone, a section of the rock wall pivoted inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. Inside, wedged into a high crevice safe from the highest tides, was a heavy, sea-worn chest bound in iron. With their hearts pounding in their chests, they carried it out onto the rocks and forced the rusted latch. It wasn't filled with minerals or gold. It was filled with something infinitely more precious, the truth. On top lay a packet of letters wrapped in oilcloth, written in a clear, elegant hand. It was the final testament of Anders Larsen, written in the frantic days after he'd been forced to flee. And then came the twist. The one that changed everything. The confession was not what they expected. Anders wrote that Leo's great-grandfather, a good and honest man, had wanted to report their discovery legally. But the third partner, the wealthy investor Alistair Finch's ancestor, wanted to cut them both out to steal the claim for himself. A violent argument on the cliffs had ended in tragedy. Finch had murdered Leo's great-grandfather, then used his wealth and influence to frame Anders Larsen, the immigrant fisherman who had no one to speak for him. The story of Anders the thief was a lie crafted to cover a murder. Leo's family wasn't the perpetrator. They were the first victim. The shame he thought he'd inherited was a lie. In its place was a profound, burning sense of injustice. But as this earth-shattering truth settled over them, a new shadow fell across the rocks. A voice slick and cold as the tide itself cut through the air. "I'll take that. It belongs to my family." Alistair Finch stood there, flanked by the same 2 men from the other night. They had followed them. They had waited. Their escape route back to the main beach was cut off. The tide, once their key, was now their jailer, its soft lapping sound a countdown to their doom as it began its relentless return, slowly swallowing the rocks around them. "It's over," Finch said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Give me the letters, and we'll let you walk away. A ghost story no one will ever believe." Leo knew it was a lie. They were loose ends. As one of the men stepped forward, reaching for the chest, a blur of black motion exploded from Leo's side. It wasn't a panicked attack. It was a precise military action. Shadow didn't go for the throat. He lunged and clamped his jaws down on the man's wrist with the perfect controlled force he had been trained to use, enough to incapacitate, not to kill. The man screamed, dropping the heavy pry bar he was holding. The sound echoed off the cliffs. For a critical second, Finch and his other man were stunned, their attention diverted. It was the opening they needed. "Clara, run!" Leo yelled, grabbing the chest. In that moment, Leo Vance was no longer a man running from his past. The ghosts of war that had haunted him were silent, replaced by a righteous fire. He wasn't fighting for land or for money, or even for self-preservation. He was fighting for the honor of his great-grandfather, a man murdered and slandered. He was fighting for Anders Larsen, a man who had lost his home, his family, and his name. He was fighting for the two families that a corporate dynasty had been built upon their foundations, cemented with blood and lies. They scrambled over the rocks, the sea licking at their heels, the shouts of Finch and his men chasing them. They had the confession. They had the truth. But in a war against a man who believed he was above the law, the truth is only a weapon, if you can live long enough to tell it. The frantic scramble over the tide-swept rocks was a blur of desperation, but they made it. Soaked, bruised, and gasping for air, Leo, Clara, and Shadow reached the safety of the main beach just as the passage they'd used was swallowed by the sea. They didn't stop. They drove straight to the offices of the state's most tenacious investigative journalist, a woman Clara knew would not bow to corporate pressure. The dam of a 70-year-old secret didn't just crack, it burst. Anders Larsen's salt-stained confession, backed by the paranoid entries in Leo's great-grandfather's journal and the paper trail of Titan Dynamics' aggressive attempts to seize the land, created a firestorm. The story was more than a corporate malfeasance case. It was a human drama of murder, betrayal, and a cover-up that had spanned generations. Alistair Finch and Titan Dynamics were buried under an avalanche of public outrage and federal investigation. The dragon had been slain not by a sword, but by the undeniable weight of the truth. The courts moved swiftly. The original mineral claim was deemed fraudulent, and the rights were legally restored to their rightful heirs, the Vance and Larsen estates. Overnight, Leo and Clara were the joint owners of a geological discovery worth billions. The world saw them as winners of a lottery they never knew they'd entered. But sitting in the quiet of the library a few weeks later, staring at the legal documents, Leo felt no sense of victory, only a profound sense of responsibility. What was a real inheritance? Was it the number in a bank account? Or was it the name you left behind? He looked at Clara and saw the same truth reflected in her eyes. They hadn't gone through this hell for money. They had done it for honor. So they made a choice. They turned down the multi-billion-dollar offers from mining corporations. Instead, they used a small portion of the settlement to establish a trust. And then they did something that shocked everyone. They donated the land and all its mineral rights to the state of Oregon, with a single, unbreakable condition that the entire coastline be turned into a protected nature preserve, a place of wild, rugged beauty that could never be bought or sold. It was named the Vance Larsen Coastal Preserve, a testament not to the wealth they had found, but to the honor they had reclaimed. The video doesn't end with a triumphant press conference. It ends a year later, on a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon. Leo is sitting on a simple wooden bench looking out over the preserve. The sea and the sky are a brilliant, peaceful blue. At his feet, Shadow, now a little grayer around the muzzle, is sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in a steady, contented rhythm. The ghosts are gone. The echoes in the silence have been replaced by the gentle sound of the wind and waves. Leo is no longer a soldier holding a defensive line. He is a man at peace in his own home. He spends his weekends volunteering for a program that rescues shelter dogs like Shadow once was, and trains them to become companions for veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war. His journey had come full circle. He was finally home. He had lost a physical legacy built on a foundation of lies, but he had found his own soul. He had turned down a fortune, but he had reclaimed his family's honor. Because in the end, we are all caretakers of the stories we inherit. And the greatest honor is not in what we own, but in the truth we protect, the peace we choose to build, and the unwavering silent loyalty of the companions who walk with us out of the darkness and into the light. If this story of loyalty, honor, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog resonated with you, it would mean the world to us if you'd let us know by hitting that like button. Every story has a lesson. What did this one mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. and your perspectives are what make this community so special. And if you believe that stories like this deserve to be heard, stories that remind us of the best parts of ourselves, share this video with someone you know. To make sure you don't miss the next journey we have waiting for you, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell to join our storytelling family. Thank you for listening. There's another tale waiting to begin, and you can find it right here on the screen now.